about Clausewitz's skepticism about the ability of the commander to control events on the battlefield, to have a full grasp of fast-moving events, the ability to obtain the right kinds of intelligence at the right time at the right place to be effective. Clausewitz is very skeptical about that, whereas Sun Tzu's texts tend to hold in high esteem the role of intelligence, the role of surprise, and things like maneuver, deception, the ability of the commander to, control the battle space and so forth. And again, I think while this is a vast oversimplification of the two very complex, nuanced texts, I think from a pedagogical perspective, it creates this really interesting dialogue that helps to generate discussion among students about strategy.
Well, let's stick with this for a moment because I found this portion of the chapter just fascinating, and in particular the way that you framed it as Sun Tzu somehow being more optimistic about the lot of the commander and the commander's ability to achieve his ends, and Clausewitz somehow being more pessimistic, but Sun Tzu's optimism being in some ways dangerous. And you drew parallels with American strategic thought or doctrinal thought, military doctrinal thought in the last generation or so. So what why is the kind of optimism evinced by Sun Tzu potentially dangerous?
Yeah, so I think, Sun Tzu's Art of War, if read selectively or if read out of context, can convey this idea that war can be a one-sided affair, right? That the commander can basically impose its will on the adversary by, through maneuver, through deception, through surprise, through superior intelligence, and so forth. And it seems to me that there is, and to me, I think that actually highlights a lot about some of the debates that we've had over the past 20 years, that some of the ideas articulated by Sun Tzu seem to parallel some of the discourse that emerged, say, beginning in the 1990s, the discourse about the revolution in military affairs that was powered by the information technology revolution. And what we saw in those debates was a very sort of Sun Tzuian discourse about the ability of the commander to have this omniscience, if you will, because of this information technology revolution, to be able to know the environment, to be able to see everything on the battle space, and therefore to be able to act and react faster than the adversary. In fact, the idea is that you could obtain such information superiority that you can not only act and react faster than the adversary, but you can actually impose friction on the enemy, and that you can maneuver faster than the enemy, you can disperse, concentrate forces better than the adversary, and so forth. And it seems to me that you don't have to have ever read Sun Tzu to succumb to the temptations of the promises of some of these technological changes. And so I think reading Sun Tzu, if you choose to read it that way, it offers in some ways a cautionary tale, the danger of succumbing to the promise of technology, the ability to lift the fog of war, and so forth. It seems to me, again, the optimism as represented by a selective sort of reading of Sun Tzu can lead to these, I think, sort of overconfident conclusions about how you can control the flow of war.
If you don't mind, spell it out a bit for us. What's wrong with that belief, with that kind of confidence in one's belief to occupy this supreme position of information dominance and the ability to impose friction on the other guy and escape it yourself? Like what in the last 20 years has shown, Joint Vision 2020 to have been perhaps over optimistic?
Well, I think what we found is that despite the technical means to gather information, to disseminate information, and so forth, is that itself becomes a problem because you become inundated with information, and you now have trouble trying to figure out what's useful information and what's not, because information technology can actually generate too much noise that actually creates its own kind of friction. What we've also found, of course, in line with Clausewitzian principles of interaction, is that the adversary will at some point obtain similar technologies and to be able to compete, perhaps even out-compete you. There are adversaries who either have the technology to compete with you symmetrically, But there are also adversaries, as we've seen with insurgents and terrorists during our global war on terror, where they used very basic primitive technologies to effectively counter our technological information superiority. And so I think information itself could be a cause of friction. And I think we should never forget that, as the saying goes, it's almost a trope that the adversary gets a vote. And so I think it was tempting to succumb to the promise of technology, but we found over the past 2 decades, in some ways, how right Clausewitz was after all.
Let's talk a bit about this concept of she, which is famously difficult to translate idea from The Art of War. Maybe I'll start there. How do you translate she, or what are the various ways in which it can be translated, and what does Sun Tzu mean by it?
Yeah, so this idea, and I'm going to pronounce it in the Chinese, but it's shi, and it is a difficult term to translate. Western scholars have interpreted in a variety of ways. Some have called it the strategic configuration of power. Sun Tzu himself, in The Art of War, uses metaphors to describe this concept. One metaphor, it's a very powerful image, is shi is like a rapidly descending hawk that strikes its prey and breaks its back. And I think what that metaphor conveys is that something as light as a bird can, because of speed, momentum, the accuracy of its descent, can generate so much kinetic power that it can break the back of its prey. Another really interesting metaphor that Sun Tzu uses is this idea that shi is like the latent energy just before a crossbowman unleashes the arrow. That it's about that it's about the configuration of power that allows the crossbow to generate so much power that it can unleash an arrow, which is of course very light, to strike with great accuracy and lethality. Another metaphor is about pushing a rock off the edge of a precipice, and it is the weight of the rock, its speed of descent as it tumbles down the precipice, and also importantly, the person pushing the rock to unlock that latent energy. Those are all different ways, visual ways of imagining what the shi is like. So there has been a debate in the West among Western scholars about what shi tells us about Chinese strategy. And that was really the approach that I took with the chapter, which is and it actually conforms to my broader framework, which is to problematize Sun Tzu in these ways, in talking about how Sun Tzu fits into some of our larger debates about the universal logic of strategy and the apparent peculiarities of Chinese strategy. And shi is a really good example of how it has helped to stimulate this debate. And so there are those in the West who argue that shi is sort of peculiarly Chinese, uniquely Chinese, as very much part of China's military traditions. And they claim that if you look at more recent Chinese warfighting, that there's evidence of shi in those approaches, whether it's Mao Zedong's campaigns during the Chinese Civil War, particularly the last year of the Chinese Civil War, where Mao's forces engaged in mobile combat operations.
To deconstruct that reading in order to construct something else. But much of what I'm doing is deconstruction rather than construction. I remember my father, when I was young, had just read R.H. Tawney's piece on the rise of the entrepreneur bourgeoisie and so on in the 17th century. And it had been attacked by H.R. Trevor Roper. He said it's a typical Trevor Roper piece because it's destroying rather than constructing anything. Somebody constructs an argument and what you do is demolish it. But of course, it's what all academics do a lot of the time. So maybe I've just fallen into the trap. So that was my concern. But what that means is that you're going to have to take on, for a start, what is the relationship between war and policy, because for so many people, that's the crucial thing about Clausewitz. And I think the other big thing I wanted to take on is the assumption that Clausewitz is always rational, always thinking about war as utilitarian. And of course, it is a more rational Clausewitz that writes on war, because when he's writing that, it's peace in Prussia. He's doing it from home. He's in Berlin at the Krieg's Academy. He's got time to do that. But when he forms his ideas, it's in the passion of war itself and a war for Prussia's survival, and a great deal of hatred, of strong emotion, and of nationalism, German nationalism rather than Prussian nationalism, comes through. So this is a Clausewitz which is not so attractive to many liberals, but was, of course, attractive to the National Socialists.
Well, perhaps we should start. I want to come to war as a continuation of policy, but before that, you spend a fair amount of time discussing this distinction, which I now realize that the words I'm about to use are sort of Howard Perret words, but this distinction between limited war and total war, which we get in Clausewitz, and then which becomes important, I guess, in particular during the Cold War among strategic thinkers. But tell us what Clausewitz meant by this distinction, and perhaps what better words are that we might use, and then about its legacy as a distinction.
Yeah. I mean, it's a very important question because, of course, it's important not just in the Cold War, but this distinction becomes important to Hans Delbrück when he's writing about Clausewitz at the end of the 19th century, becomes important to Julian Corbett when he thinks about it at the beginning of the 20th century, when he uses Clausewitz. My reading is and it's not a very original reading, I'm dependent on others for much of this, but my reading is when Clausewitz sits down to write on war, which he declares as an intention in 1816, when he writes to Gneisenau, another man very important in his life, and says that's what he's going to do, that what he's concerned with is what he's experienced, the war, is it the war he knows? How does he make a theory out of that? How does he think about war in the light of that experience? So I suspect the easy bit for Clausewitz was writing what we would now regard as the sort of middle chunk of On War. The book 4 on battle, for example, which is absolutely the battles that he served in, or Borodino, and he was present at least in the campaign of Waterloo and so on. That's what he's reflecting. But then he confronts a problem because he wants to write a theory that's applicable across generations, that isn't simply reflective of Napoleonic warfare. And he doesn't have a way of making what he has experienced universal. I mean, there's a point, a very rare reflective point, where he says, we really don't know what war in the future will be like. Will it be absolute war, which is how he sees Napoleonic warfare to have been, a phrase which in the 1970s you'd be tempted to equate with total war, but it's not what he's thinking about. But will it be that, or will it be something lesser? And his argument is essentially, having experienced something as complete as absolute war, we're unlikely to roll back from it. That's likely to be the future. But if you read that, for example, in the 1850s, when there had just been the 1848 revolutions in Europe, which had caused wars, but wars which have been contained and limited, which led on to the Crimean War, which we tend to see as a limited war, then you would have said, well, actually, no, powers have learnt to use war with restraint, and that argument might hold up until 1914. So he asked that question, but he asked that question because what he does is look back when he's confronted with this problem, not look forward. He doesn't know what's coming. And he looks back to the 18th century, which he's one of the principal authors among those who classify the 18th century as a war of limited war. He sees this as a period when Europe does not mobilize the whole of its society for the purposes of war, where what you do is determined by monarchs rather than by the whole people, rather than by the nation, and where there is the possibility of negotiation at the end of the conflict, rather than outright defeat and a dictated peace. So he sets up this theoretical premise in the introductory note, which is the one of the two introductory notes we have. Crucially, this one is dated to the 10th of July, 1827. So we know when he wrote it. And we know from things he wrote to Marion von Clausewitz in the same year, Marion von Bruhl, this was a moment of crisis in his life anyway, whether he was just feeling depressed or whether he felt he lost direction in relation to the writing of the book. is unclear, but it could well be the latter, because he's realizing he can't write an account of one war which simply rests on Napoleonic War, that he has to recognize other forms of war for it to be a complete theory, but he doesn't know how to set about it. Because what he does in this is say there are two types of war, not one type of war. So it's not a complete theory. And he then says in the next paragraph, well, policy is what war is about. But he doesn't necessarily say, as explicitly as he might at that point, that it's policy that determines whether this war will be a limited war, a war for a negotiated settlement, or a war for a dictated peace, an absolute war, a major war. But that clearly becomes perfected by the end of the year. Peter Perret published, and they were known before, but he published 2 notes which Clausewitz wrote in response to an exercise the Prussian General Staff was doing on the sort of war it might fight. And he wrote back saying, how can you ask me to judge whether this is an appropriate plan or not, unless you tell me what you're fighting for? What's the political context? And that's where it becomes absolutely clear that the relationship between war and policy has now become central to his thinking.
Yeah.
So that note is very important, and it does provide inspiration for others who then wish to look at war as being of 2 types, that war can be fought as a limited war. War can be fought as an existential conflict, as a war of annihilation. Of course, is the verb, or or Venuction is the noun, rather, that he uses to explain that. I think the big challenge here is that is entirely a theoretical distinction. So you can begin. I mean, let's take the war in Ukraine right now. It's a war of national survival for Ukraine. It could become a war of national survival for Russia. It's not entirely clear, but Putin's reputation and survival as a president might be on the line as a result of this war and his relative lack of success so far. On the other hand, it is limited in the sense that it's been confined to Ukraine, limited in the sense that it hasn't escalated to nuclear weapons, and to that extent can be seen as a contained war. So if we were to describe the war in Ukraine as limited at the moment, that doesn't mean it couldn't become a much greater war, which is precisely why the president is concerned about the dangers of escalation. And Clausewitz doesn't really address that problem. He hints at it in the note. He says, the condition can change. And equally, a war that begins in big terms can end up in small terms. So, after the 9/11 attacks, when the Bush administration decided on the global war on terror, it also said, there'll be no compromise with the Taliban, refused to allow the inclusion of the Taliban in Hamid Karzai's provisional government in Afghanistan. In the end, of course, the United States does a deal with the Taliban and gets out. So war can move from being one thing to another. It doesn't remain constantly whatever it might have been intended to be from the outset. And that's just partly the consequence of time, but it's also partly the consequence of war. Another crucial Clausewitzian point: war is a reciprocal act. It depends on the other side. You don't have the sole decision in this.
I suppose this is something that comes to the fore when one is actually reading Clausewitz carefully or learning about Clausewitz from a scholar such as yourself, which is its sort of essential fluidity and sort of openness to the complicated nature of the phenomenon that he is discussing, as opposed to sort of caricature Clausewitz, which, just to pick one example, and if I'm either too hard or too soft here in my attempt to channel your criticism, feel free to correct me, but you have an interesting riff on Colin Powell and the way in which the post-Vietnam era U.S. military sort of embraces this very crisp notion of the role of government making policy, the role of the military, and setting policy objectives for military operations, the role of the military in carrying that out, the requirement in this theory of the case that the military have and be given decisive means, that this is sort of the way to do war. It ought to be done this way and not in any other way, not like that mess we just had in Indochina. And by the way, this is what Clausewitz prescribes. Is that fair as sort of the basic thinking of the 80s and 90s? And in what ways is it? Why did you highlight this example as a sort of interesting reception of Clausewitz?
Because it really it captures the moment when the US embraces Clausewitz. I think it's important to recognize in the context of American strategy how important not Clausewitz but Jomini remains until very late in US strategic thinking. The argument that Jomini is very important in the education of Civil War generals is well rehearsed, and that Dennis Hart Mahan, taught Jomini to West Point cadets before 1861, and that's what they all thought about as they went off to war. But as Bruno Coulson has shown in a book on Jomini and American strategy, the Jominian approach remains pretty central to US thought right up until the Cold War.
Severe constraints on the use of American power beyond South Vietnam. And from the beginning, the generals, Westmoreland and also the Joint Chiefs of Staff, are saying the enemy is sending huge amounts of men and material through Laos and Cambodia. At minimum, we should send our ground troops in there to stop them. And possibly we should even go into North Vietnam and invade North Vietnam because that's the source of enemy's power. Otherwise, we're just going to be sitting here killing North Vietnamese, but they can just keep sending more and more, and it's never going to end. And Johnson and McNamara turned them down for several reasons. One is they don't really understand the magnitude of the infiltration for a long time, and they buy this notion, which is pushed by civilian theorists, that this is mainly a locally sustained effort. It doesn't require all this external support. They also think that going to North Vietnam will trigger a Chinese invasion, much as happened in the Korean War. And we know from subsequent revelations that really was not a possibility. The Chinese had no interest in going back in, but wasn't clear at the time. And then also the generals are calling for intensive bombing of North Vietnam, and McNamara instead has this concept of gradual escalation, which is again derived from these academic conflict limitation ideas that no, we don't hit hard. We kind of start off low and we can gradually escalate, and this will leave us better negotiating options over time. The opposite actually turns out to be true because it conveys weakness and it allows the North Vietnamese to build up their strength. Now, within South Vietnam, I think the U.S. actually does a better job than they're given credit for. Westmoreland is faulted for fighting a war of attrition and trying to bleed the enemy, and that this was sort of a lack of strategic imagination. But I actually think if you can't extend the borders, there really wasn't much of a better option. And some people often think and argue that, well, what we needed to do was to focus more on counterinsurgency and controlling the village populations. And they point to the Marine Combined Action Platoons in this context, where the Marines sent a squad of Marines into a village to work with local militia, and that seemed to work pretty well. Problem with that is that by 1965, there is this massive North Vietnamese army presence, and you have North Vietnamese army, you're now starting to see entire North Vietnamese army divisions showing up. And when you have a battalion of the North Vietnamese army and they decide they want to take a village, they're going to crush your little village defense force. A Marine squad and a Vietnamese militia platoon do not stand a chance against, a big North Vietnamese regular force. And we do see, in fact, the combined action platoon outposts get overrun frequently. And so it's recognized pretty early on, even by, Marine Corps is actually the most skeptical initially of Westmoreland's sort of search and destroy tactics, which is you kind of go everywhere to find the enemy. But they eventually recognize that you have to do it because when you have these big concentrations of NVA, you really only have two options. One is you go out and try to hit them in the remote areas, which is what Westmoreland is pushing, or you wait until they come to you. And when that happens, though, you're ceding the initiative of the enemy, so they can mass in overwhelming force at a given point if you cede the initiative to them. And also, if they really get into a big areas like this, they did in the city of Hue in 1968, you end up having to fight and destroy the populated areas in order to get them out. So I think Westmoreland, has been judged unfairly. I do, even some of the people who I tend to agree with overall on big picture of the war, some of them have been very critical of Westmoreland and see a big change between him and General Creighton Abrams, but I actually argue that there really isn't that much difference between Westmoreland and Abrams. And what happens with Abrams is he comes in at a period when the North Vietnamese are in a low point, or they hit a low point after he gets there, and then that allows him to change. But when he first comes in, he's actually doing the same things that Westmoreland has been doing.
So there really are kind of two parallel efforts that need to, well, I'm going to say this and then you tell me if you agree. There are two parallel efforts that need to be maintained. A conventional threat from North Vietnamese regulars requires some kind of conventional response. And your point is Westmoreland is sort of criticized for pursuing that track.
Mm-hmm.
But there is probably also, I think, right, a need for a, call it what you like, counterinsurgency effort, but you can't pit that against a conventional threat that will work against, Viet Cong and local insurgents and malefactors. But these tracks kind of have to run simultaneously or at their proper times and places. How would you phrase it?
Yeah, I mean, generally for the most part, you kind of have to maintain both of them, at least for much of the war, because, of course, how you manage that will also affect what the North Vietnamese do. If they see you don't have that conventional threat area, they may escalate their conventional operations, and if they see you're not doing much on the pacification or counterinsurgency side, they'll focus more on there. And military commanders will often talk about maintaining, they call a shield, basically using the bigger units to shield the villages from large enemy forces. And we've also seen, again, from what we see from the North Vietnamese side, they actually view this approach of Westmoreland's to be very effective in countering what they want to do, and that they run into lots of problems because Americans are out aggressively looking for them. It makes them harder to move around. And one of the other big thing I found, which hasn't been well known, is that American operations also do a lot to disrupt North Vietnamese logistics inside South Vietnam, and they suffer from acute food shortages by 1966, such that they have to postpone or cancel a lot of their military operations. They don't have enough rice in particular. And this is also a controversy relevant to the bombing, because McNamara thinks there's this huge excess supply capacity in North Vietnam, which actually doesn't exist. And we now know the North Vietnamese are suffering badly from lack of food.
How do you think about some of the problems and obvious challenges with the sort of the metrics of attrition? And how do you fit that into your broader defense of Westmoreland? Because to take one vivid account that was moving to me, because it reminded me of things that in a different way I had experienced in Afghanistan. Carl Merlante's sort of ground level account of being a Marine infantry officer engaged in these conventional operations, and the way in which body counts in particular just become, sort of fugazi numbers almost from the moment that they're taken, right? I mean, at the tactical level, the numbers are fictions and impressionistic, and then get distorted at every level on the way up. For me, this reminded me of the sort of clear hold build accounting that we would do at the sub-district level in Afghanistan, which to me seemed similarly fugazi and divorced from reality. But these numbers are driving, right? We can pull maybe McNamara into this on some level. These numbers, this sort of metric approach to warfare, is driving a lot of American decision-making and certainly American impressions of success or failure. So do you defend this as well? Am I misunderstanding this? Or is this a fair hit on the American conduct of the war, 65 to 68?
There are certainly some excesses and quite a bit of false reporting. It's partly why there is this emphasis on the body count, because if you do count the bodies, then presumably it's hard to, if people are being honest, it's harder to fake that. One of the biggest problems you have is that many of the casualties inflicted on the enemy are from air power artillery, and the North Vietnamese will often remove those casualties before they can be counted. And so there's a great amount of uncertainty in that regard. And sometimes people say, well, we think, we killed this many, but we can't be sure. And they withdrew this many. I mean, there certainly is pressure on a lot of commanders to, get a high body count and relative to U.S. personnel, especially. Now, there is, and certainly some of that can go overboard, but I do think the general idea that you're trying to reduce the number of enemy forces, which is essentially what attrition is about, makes sense given the other parameters, because the Americans are trying to buy time for the South Vietnamese And we also have, a lot of the criticism of the body count implies or even says that basically we thought we were killing far more of the enemy than we actually were, and we didn't understand that everything we were doing was hopeless. Well, we have North Vietnamese accounts, which are very telling in terms of actually confirming a lot of what General Westmoreland was saying. At one point, General Giap, admits that this is 1969, they suffered 500,000 casualties, which is very close to the American number that was being put out. So the numbers, I think, are actually more accurate than we had been led to believe. And again, another reason to think that actually what Westmoreland doing is largely working. The other thing that's interesting on this point is that, again, there's this tendency in the Orthodox narrative to kind of view the Americans as being really stupid and the North Vietnamese as being these great geniuses. So we now know from the North Vietnamese accounts that when the American troops come in, North Vietnamese are taking horrific casualties, and the North Vietnamese commanders who are in the South, they are also facing pressure to, show results. And so what they do, if I'm the North Vietnamese, battalion commander, I lost, 100 guys in a battle. Well, I may have only killed 10 Americans, but that would look really bad. So I'm going to tell my superiors, well, we killed 200 Americans.